The sound of his laughter was the final lie. For months I played the fool, the quiet Texas wife who believed his excuses, ignored the scent of foreign perfume, and rationalized the way he flinched whenever I touched his phone. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the woman he married was blind. I let him finish the joke he told his friend. I regret marrying her every day. I was holding a glass of iced tea. I did not move. I did not shatter. I just waited for the punchline to finish, and when the last echo of his dismissive, arrogant laughter died in our home, I answered him. My voice was a whisper, but it cut through his smug certainty like wire. So do I. His smile didn't just fade, it died. You could see the exact moment the blood drained from his face, the moment he realized the naive wife was gone, and he was staring into the eyes of his executioner. He started stammering, looking around the room for the microphone, the camera, the trick. He didn't know how I knew about Samantha. He didn't know I'd found the financial guarantee that put our entire life on the line. He only knew that the woman who had been his anchor was about to become the axe. What do you do when your own husband jokes about your destruction? You don't cry. You don't scream. You wait until his arrogance has exposed his one fatal vulnerability, and then you quietly ask him, "How much is your joke going to cost you?" My name is Clara, and this is the story of how a joke, a single, careless line became the catalyst for dismantling everything I thought I knew about love, marriage, and the man I shared my life with. Texas, they say, is a place where dreams are big and hearts are even bigger. For a long time, I believed that. I believed in the sprawling skies, the quiet strength of the land, and the promise of a life built on solid ground. I met David in a sun-drenched cafe in Austin. He was charming, charismatic, with a laugh that filled the room. He spoke of ambition, of a future, of a shared life that felt both thrilling and comforting. He was everything I thought I wanted. He saw me, truly saw me, or so I thought. We married 2 years later under a canopy of oak trees, a perfect spring day. The vows we exchanged felt sacred, unbreakable. Forever. That word, so heavy with meaning, floated in the warm Texas air. For the first few years, our life was a tapestry woven with small joys and shared dreams. We bought a modest house, started building our careers. I was a graphic designer, he was making his way in real estate. We talked about children, about travel, about growing old together on a porch swing. These were the foundations, the bedrock of our union. But even then, if I listen closely now, I can hear the faint, almost imperceptible cracks beginning to form beneath the surface. Like the subtle tremors before an earthquake, you don't always notice them until it's too late. He started working longer hours. Business trips became more frequent. At first, I understood. Ambition, he said, for us. I supported him, believed in him, poured my energy into making our home a sanctuary he'd long for after a grueling week. I cooked his favorite meals, listened to his endless stories about difficult clients, offered quiet encouragement when he doubted himself. My love for him felt boundless, a deep well I drew from every single day. Then the small things started. A dismissive wave of his hand when I tried to share my day. A forgotten anniversary. A casual remark about my appearance that stung more than he could ever know. I rationalized them away. Stress. Pressure. He was under a lot of strain. I told myself that love meant understanding, meant forgiveness. It meant weathering the storms. But the storms were becoming more frequent, and the warmth of his affection felt increasingly distant, like a dwindling ember. I remember one evening, cooking dinner. I'd spent hours preparing his favorite chili. He walked in, tossed his keys onto the counter, barely glanced at me. "Smells edible," he said, and walked straight to the TV. Not a hug, not a kiss, not even a "how was your day?" Just edible. It was a tiny pinprick, but it was enough to deflate the carefully constructed balloon of my efforts. I swallowed the disappointment, telling myself it was nothing. Just a bad day. Just a bad day for him. The words became sharper, the distance wider. Our conversations were transactional, revolving around bills, groceries, his work. We stopped sharing secrets, stopped dreaming together. It was as if we were two strangers cohabiting, occasionally intersecting but never truly connecting. I felt like I was fading, becoming transparent in our own home. My voice, once vibrant, became softer, hesitant. I started second-guessing myself, questioning my own worth. One night, I caught him on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. He quickly hung up when he saw me. Just a client, he said, too quickly, too brightly. A cold prickle of unease started in my stomach. Was it a client? Or was it something else? I pushed the thought away, blaming my own insecurities. He was a busy man. I was being paranoid. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to take root. And it was a seed that would eventually blossom into a forest of thorns. He started staying out later, coming home with flimsy excuses. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume on his collar, dismissed as a client's wife who'd gotten too close in a crowded elevator. Little lies, carefully constructed, but they were beginning to unravel the fabric of my trust. I tried to talk to him, to bridge the growing chasm between us. I asked him if everything was all right, if he was happy. He would brush me off, or worse, turn it back on me, accusing me of being needy, dramatic. "Clara, you're overthinking things," he'd say, his voice laced with an exasperation that cut deeper than any anger. I remember staring at my reflection one morning, truly seeing myself. The vibrancy had dulled. The light in my eyes had dimmed. I was a shadow of the woman who had once stood beneath the oak trees, full of hope. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that something fundamental had shifted. I just didn't know how deep the rot went. Not yet. But I would soon find out. And the discovery would be far more devastating than any fear I could have conjured. This story, the one you're about to hear, isn't just about heartbreak. It's about the quiet strength born from betrayal, the power of a woman underestimated, and the cold satisfaction of justice. If you're here, watching this, it's because you understand that feeling of being unseen, unheard, dismissed. Don't let your story fade into silence. Join our community. Subscribe right now, before you forget, and be part of a place where truths are told, and strength is found. The subtle shifts in a marriage are often more insidious than the dramatic explosions. They're like erosion, slowly wearing away at the foundation until you realize there's nothing left but dust. For me, the erosion accelerated. David became a master of subtle gaslighting. My concerns were always, imagined, my feelings, overreactions. He created a reality where I was the unstable one, the one with the issues, while he remained the stoic, burdened husband. I started documenting things, almost subconsciously at first. Dates he was late, excuses he gave, the way he'd flinch when I touched his phone. It wasn't a conscious act of suspicion. It was an attempt to validate my own sanity. To prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. The woman I was becoming was a stranger to me, cautious, observant, constantly on edge. It was exhausting, living in that state of perpetual uncertainty. Our once easy laughter was replaced by strained silences. He'd spend evenings scrolling on his phone, occasionally chuckling at something I wasn't privy to. If I asked, he'd say, "Just work emails," or "A funny meme from a friend." But the way he'd instinctively angle the screen away from me, the slight tremor in his voice, these small tells spoke volumes louder than his words. My gut screamed at me, a constant, low thrum of warning. One particularly cold evening, I heard him on the phone in his study, the door slightly ajar. His voice was lower, softer than I'd heard it in months, almost tender. He was whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. The tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of a man deeply engrossed, intimately connected, to someone else. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, the sound of his modulated voice echoing in the quiet house, a piercing siren of betrayal. I retreated to our bedroom, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. I tried to tell myself it was a business call, a sensitive client. But the tenderness, the hushed intimacy, it contradicted every plausible explanation. He came to bed later, acting as if nothing was amiss. He even made a perfunctory attempt to kiss my forehead, a gesture that felt like a mockery. I turned away, feigning sleep, my mind racing, constructing scenarios, each one more painful than the last. I felt a tear slip onto my pillow, quickly wiped away. I wouldn't let him see me break. Not yet. The next morning, I tried to confront him, gently. "David, who were you talking to last night? I heard you sounded different." He froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Clara, I told you it was a client. A sensitive negotiation. You know how these things are." His eyes, however, wouldn't meet mine. They darted away, betrayed by a micro-expression of guilt. That was all I needed. That fleeting moment of evasion. My suspicions were no longer just suspicions. They were solidifying into something real, something tangible, something devastating. He started leaving his phone face down more often. He'd take it into the bathroom with him, a habit he'd never had before. I noticed he'd changed his password, or at least I couldn't unlock it with the old one. These small acts, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, painted a chilling picture when connected. He was hiding something, meticulously, deliberately. He was building a wall, brick by brick, between us, and I was on the outside, watching it rise. The silence grew heavy, loaded with unspoken truths. We stopped eating dinner together at the table. He'd eat in front of the TV. I'd eat in the kitchen, pretending to be busy. The physical distance in our house mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between us. I felt like I was living with a ghost, a presence that was there but utterly absent. I yearned for the man I married, but he was gone, replaced by this guarded, evasive stranger. And then, I saw it. The first undeniable piece of evidence, and it wasn't a text or a call. It was far more intimate. And far more public. The truth often arrives not with a bang but with a quiet whisper, a visual clue that shatters your carefully constructed illusions. For me, it was an Instagram post. A photo. Innocent enough at first glance. David, at a business conference in Dallas, standing with a group of colleagues. He'd mentioned this conference, dismissed it as tedious, but there she was, standing next to him, a woman with bright blonde hair and an easy smile, her hand lightly, almost proprietarily, on his arm. It wasn't the touch that screamed betrayal. It was his smile. A genuine, unburdened smile that I hadn't seen directed at me in months. It reached his eyes, crinkling them at the corners, a pure, unadulterated joy that he no longer shared with me. My breath hitched. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger, a happier, freer version of my husband, living a life I wasn't part of. I zoomed in. Her eyes were fixed on him, a look of adoration that mirrored my own from so long ago. My chest tightened, a physical ache that stole the air from my lungs. Who was she? Why was her hand on him like that? Why was his smile so genuine for her? The questions cascaded, relentless. I scrolled through her profile. Public. Photos of her at various networking events, always impeccably dressed, always smiling. And then I saw another one. A selfie of her at the same conference, and in the background, out of focus, was David, looking at her. That same smile. My hands trembled as I put down my phone. The room started to spin. All the little lies, the evasions, the phone calls, the late nights, the emotional distance, they coalesced into one undeniable, crushing reality. He was having an affair. The woman in the photo wasn't just a colleague. She was the reason. She was the one who had replaced me in his affections, in his life. My world, which had been slowly fracturing, finally splintered into a million pieces. I spent the rest of the day in a haze. I went through the motions, but my mind was a storm of disbelief and agony. How could he? How could the man who promised me forever, the man I loved, betray me so completely? The pain was a physical entity, a vice clamping down on my heart. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break things. But a strange, cold resolve began to settle over me. It wasn't just sadness, it was anger. A deep, burning anger that surprised me with its intensity. When David came home, he was oblivious. He talked about his day, about a new real estate deal he was closing. He even tried to initiate a casual conversation, asking me about my work. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger. A deceptive, manipulative stranger. How long had he been living this double life? How long had he been lying to my face, sharing my bed, while his heart belonged to someone else? The thought was sickening. I felt a chill spread through my veins. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. The heartbroken wife began to recede, replaced by someone colder, someone utterly devoid of the warmth he had taken for granted. I didn't confront him that night. The anger was too raw, too volatile. I knew that if I spoke, I would shatter, or I would unleash a fury that would only leave me more exposed. Instead, I retreated into myself, into the icy silence of my own thoughts. I observed him, watched his every move, every subtle tell. He was so confident in his deception, so arrogant in his belief that he had me fooled. It was insulting. It was a profound disrespect. And it fueled the fire that was beginning to burn within me. I realized then that this wasn't just about his betrayal. It was about my dignity, my worth, my life that he was treating with such contempt. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not let this stand. He had broken our vows. He had shattered my trust. Now it was time for consequences, but not the kind he would expect. Not a tearful confrontation. No. This would be different. This would be a quiet, calculated dismantling. And it would begin with me, learning everything. Absolutely everything. The initial shock gave way to a chilling clarity. The raw pain of betrayal was still there, a constant throb, but beneath it, something new began to stir, a quiet resolve, a strategic mind awakening. I realized that crying, pleading, or even yelling would only serve to satisfy David's ego, to confirm his narrative that I was the emotional one. No. This required a different approach, an approach he would never anticipate. I began to observe him with a detached precision, as if he were a specimen under a microscope. His routines, his habits, his phone usage, the brief moments of vulnerability when he thought he was alone. I started compiling a mental dossier, and then a physical one. I created a hidden folder on my computer, a digital vault for the fragments of his deception. Screenshots, timestamps, vague comments he'd let slip. Every piece of information was a tool, a weapon I was gathering for a battle he didn't even know was coming. My home, once a sanctuary, transformed into a surveillance post. I learned to mimic his schedule, to anticipate his movements. When he was in the shower, I'd check his wallet for receipts. When he was at the gym, I'd discreetly go through his car, looking for anything out of place. It felt invasive, violating, but the violation he had inflicted upon me was far greater. This was self-preservation. This was the silent scream of a woman reclaiming her power. I discovered small things first. A receipt for a florist he never used for me, dated just before the Dallas conference. A coffee shop receipt from a town an hour away again, on a day he claimed to be working from home. These were breadcrumbs leading me down a dark path. Each discovery, though small, was a confirmation, solidifying the cold anger that had replaced my heartbreak. It wasn't personal anymore, not entirely. It was a problem to be solved. An injustice to be rectified. I discreetly reached out to a friend of a friend who worked in IT security, pretending it was for a friend's troubled marriage. I learned about ways to track phone usage, about hidden data, about the digital footprint we all leave behind. I spent hours online, educating myself, becoming an amateur detective in my own life. I learned about burner phones, about encrypted messaging apps, about the subtle art of digital deception. David, for all his arrogance, was careless in some areas. And I was becoming meticulous. He was so comfortable, so complacent in his lies. He'd even joke about it, though not directly to me. I overheard him on the phone with a friend once, laughing about pulling a fast one on someone. The context was unclear, but the underlying sentiment was not. He enjoyed the game. He enjoyed the deception. And that solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about pain. It was about justice. It was about showing him the true cost of his game. This wasn't going to be a messy divorce. This was going to be an unraveling. My plan began to take shape. A silent blueprint in my mind. It was complex, layered, and built on patience. I knew I couldn't act impulsively. Every move had to be precise, every step considered. I needed to understand the full scope of his betrayal, the identities involved, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. I needed to know everything about his finances, his career, his aspirations. I needed to see the complete architecture of his life, so I could strategically dismantle it. And then, a breakthrough. A moment of pure luck. Or perhaps, fate. He left his laptop open, unattended, for just a few precious minutes. His email was open. And there, in his inbox, was an email from Samantha, the blonde woman from the Instagram photo. The subject line, "Missing you already." My heart didn't clench this time. It solidified into a block of ice. The picture was complete. And with it, a new chapter of my story began. A chapter of quiet vengeance. Samantha. The name now had a face, a reality, an undeniable presence in our shattered lives. Her email was brief, a casual update about her flight, a longing sentiment, but the attachments were a treasure trove. Photos. More photos of them together. Intimate, clearly not business colleagues. One of them, a selfie taken in what looked like a hotel room, showed them incredibly close, his arm around her. The sheer audacity of it, sending these to his main email, in a folder labeled Personal, Ignore. He thought he was so clever. I downloaded everything, quickly, carefully. My fingers moved with a practiced precision I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't just downloading evidence of an affair. I was downloading the complete disregard he had for our marriage, for me. The weight of those files felt heavy, not just data, but the accumulated insult, the shattered trust, the stolen years. Each photo, each message, was a shard of glass, cutting deeper. But there was more. I found emails detailing shared expenses, a weekend getaway booked under a false name, coded messages referencing our secret project. This wasn't a fleeting indiscretion. This was a sustained, deliberate, and expensive affair. He was spending money on her, money that was ostensibly ours, money that was meant for our future, our dreams. The financial betrayal added another layer to the emotional wound. It wasn't just my heart he was breaking. It was our shared security, our future, our very foundation. I also discovered her profession. She was a budding interior designer, freelancing, trying to make a name for herself. And David, conveniently, was in real estate. It wasn't just a romantic entanglement. It was a professional one too. He was using his connections, his influence, to help her career. He was investing in her future, while neglecting ours. The cold calculation of his actions began to truly sink in. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a strategic manipulator. I spent days, weeks, meticulously piecing together the narrative. I cross-referenced dates, tracked locations, even looked up public records for Samantha. Her social media was a goldmine of information, detailing her movements, her aspirations, her network. I learned about her friends, her family, her vulnerabilities. I was building a comprehensive profile of both David and Samantha, understanding their interconnected lives. This wasn't revenge born of blind rage. This was revenge sculpted by detailed knowledge. He was so oblivious. He would come home, still operating under the delusion that I was the same naive wife he'd married. He'd make casual remarks about his hard work, his dedication. I would nod, offer a non-committal response, my mind light years away, calculating, planning, anticipating. The irony was palpable. He thought he was the one with the secrets, the one in control. He had no idea I was silently orchestrating the collapse of his carefully constructed world. The true turning point came when I found a document, a set of proposals, official looking, for a new real estate development. And Samantha's name was listed as the lead interior designer for the project. Not just a minor consultant, but the lead. This was no casual fling. This was an investment in a shared future, a future that excluded me entirely. This project, I later learned, was a significant undertaking for David's company, a huge leap forward in his career. He was literally building his future with her, on the ruins of our marriage. The revelation was like a sharp intake of breath. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about money, power, and a deliberate attempt to erase me from his life, both personally and professionally. My resolve hardened into something unbreakable. I saw the scope of his betrayal, and in that moment, I understood what I had to do. I had to hit him where it truly hurt, his reputation, his career, his carefully cultivated image. And I had to do it in a way that left him utterly bewildered, with no one to blame but himself. The quiet hours became my solace, and my crucible. While David slept, oblivious, I would sit in the darkness, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the grim reality of my situation. I looked at old photographs of us, our wedding day, holidays, birthdays. I traced the happy smiles, the genuine light in our eyes, trying to find the man I married. But he was gone. Replaced by the image of the man in the hotel room selfie, his arm around Samantha. The heartbreak was a dull ache, constantly present. It wasn't the kind of pain that made you wail. It was the kind that settled deep in your bones, a pervasive coldness. I grieved for the future we had envisioned, for the trust that was so carelessly shattered. I grieved for the woman I used to be, the one who believed in happy endings and unconditional love. That woman was now a casualty of his deceit. I remembered a conversation we had early in our marriage. He'd said, "Clara, you're the anchor. You're the one who keeps me grounded." The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He didn't want an anchor. He wanted a launchpad, someone to support his ascent while he jettisoned me when I was no longer useful. He had used me, emotionally and financially, for his own ambition, and that realization was more infuriating than any specific act of infidelity. I thought about my parents, their quiet, enduring love. They had taught me about commitment, about weathering life storms together. I had believed in that ideal. I had built my life around it. To have it so casually dismissed, so utterly defiled by his actions, was a profound betrayal not just of me, but of every value I held dear. This wasn't just about my pain. It was about the erosion of something sacred. There were moments, late at night, when the doubt would creep in. Was I doing the right thing? Was this vengeful path truly serving me? Could I simply walk away, lick my wounds, and start fresh? But then I would remember his casual jokes, his dismissive tone, his utter lack of remorse. I would remember that fateful phrase, "I regret marrying her every day." That was the turning point. That was the moment my heartbreak solidified into something colder, something stronger. He didn't just regret me, he disrespected me. And that, I realized, was unforgivable. I understood that my emotional recovery was inextricably linked to this next phase. I couldn't heal if I allowed him to walk away unscathed, leaving me to carry the full weight of his actions. I needed to reclaim my narrative. I needed to stand firm, not just for myself but for every woman who has been dismissed, betrayed, and underestimated. This wasn't petty revenge. It was a profound act of self-empowerment. It was about proving to myself, and to him, that I was not disposable. I started seeing a lawyer, discreetly, of course, not to file for divorce yet, but to understand my options, my rights. I spoke to a financial advisor, again, under the guise of future planning. I was preparing. I was building my own fortifications, securing my own future, brick by carefully laid brick. I needed to ensure that when the dust settled, I would not be left vulnerable. David, meanwhile, continued his charade, oblivious. He'd come home, chat about his day, occasionally try to engage me in superficial conversation. I would respond, calmly, politely, giving nothing away. I became an actress in my own life, playing the part of the devoted, slightly naive wife, while underneath, a storm was brewing. The silence between us, once a symbol of our growing distance, now became my shield, my weapon. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that the time was coming when the shield would drop and the weapon would be deployed. The first step was to sow the seeds of doubt, not in my mind, but in his. The plan began to take shape, not as a sudden burst of anger, but as a deliberate, intricate web. I needed to manipulate circumstances, to nudge events, to make David believe that his mistakes were his alone, and that my actions were merely reactions to his folly. The key was plausible deniability. I would be the unseen architect, pulling strings from the shadows. My first target was his confidence, that arrogant certainty that he could always get away with anything. I began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, disrupt his routines. Little things, moving his keys just slightly so he'd spend an extra minute looking for them. Rearranging documents on his desk so he'd question where he'd left them. Nothing major, nothing he could pinpoint. Just enough to create a persistent, low-level hum of irritation and self-doubt. I started sending anonymous, cryptic emails to his work email, from a disposable account. They were vague, referencing unprofessional conduct and potential conflicts of interest in relation to the new real estate development. No names, no specifics, just enough to plant a seed of unease. He'd dismiss them, of course, but the seed would be there, festering. He'd wonder who knew. He'd wonder what they knew. And that fear, that paranoia, would begin to erode his composure. I also began to accidentally leave subtle clues around the house. A half-read article about infidelity statistics on the coffee table. A printed email from my lawyer about marital rights left on my desk, just visible enough if he happened to glance over. I didn't point them out. I didn't accuse. I just let them sit there quietly, like ticking time bombs, waiting to be discovered, waiting to spark that flicker of apprehension in his eyes. He would see them, dismiss them, but they would linger. Like a phantom itch. My behavior shifted too. I became subtly less available. When he'd call, I wouldn't always answer immediately. When he suggested dinner, I might politely decline, citing a sudden prior engagement. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle withdrawal, an indication that my world no longer solely revolved around him. He noticed, of course. He even commented once, "You're busy lately." I just smiled, a small, enigmatic smile. "Just trying to make the most of my time, David." He didn't know how true that was. I also started cultivating new friendships, joining local groups, expanding my social circle. Not just for the show but for myself. I needed support, and I needed to build a life independent of him. This outward appearance of moving on, of becoming independent, was another subtle attack on his ego. He thrived on my dependence, on my need for him. To see me thrive without him was a silent, powerful blow. He wanted me to be small, to be grateful. I was becoming vast. Then came the moment of deliberate exposure. I took one of the most incriminating photos, the hotel room selfie of him and Samantha, and discreetly saved it to a generic USB drive. I then lost the USB drive. Not in our house but in his car. Tucked deep into the glove compartment, beneath some old papers. I knew he'd eventually find it, rummaging for something. The intention wasn't for him to immediately understand its significance, but for him to discover it at a moment when he was already feeling agitated, already questioning things. It was a carefully placed piece of evidence, designed to cause maximum internal chaos. I imagined him finding it, the flicker of recognition, the sudden jolt of fear. And then the scrambling. The desperate attempts to rationalize. "I think you oughter why." To explain away, to understand how it got there. He would start looking over his shoulder. He would start questioning my knowledge without ever having proof. And that, I knew, was where the real unraveling would begin. The USB drive was planted. The waiting began. It was a test of patience, a dance on the edge of a precipice. I watched David closely, looking for any shift in his demeanor, any sign that he had found it. He became more irritable, more distracted. His phone was an even greater obsession, now constantly silenced, face down, as if he expected the device itself to betray him. The anonymous emails I had sent to his work, referencing unprofessional conduct, had clearly taken root. He was paranoid. He was starting to suspect enemies everywhere. This was crucial. I needed him looking outward, suspecting competitors, rivals, or disgruntled colleagues. He needed to be blind to the quiet storm brewing right beside him. I continued my act, the slightly withdrawn, almost melancholic wife, consumed by her own quiet work. I was the last person he would ever suspect, because suspicion would mean admitting his own monumental failure in deception. It happened on a Tuesday. He was rushing out, already late for a meeting with investors regarding the new development project, the one with Samantha. He frantically searched the kitchen for a lost pen. I watched from the archway, my heart beating a steady, cold rhythm. He cursed under his breath, threw his briefcase onto the counter, and stomped out to the garage, intending to search his car. Moments later, I heard the subtle sounds of frustration, the glove compartment slamming open, papers rustling. Then, silence. A profound, unnatural silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. I imagined him holding the drive, plugging it into his car's console, seeing the file name, the thumbnail of the image, and the blood draining from his face. The hotel room, Samantha's smile, his hand on her waist, the digital ghost of his crime, staring back at him. He walked back into the house, his face pale, his composure visibly shaken. He didn't look at me directly. He grabbed his briefcase, his movements jerky, unnatural. "Found the pen?" I asked, my voice light, casual, the picture of innocent domesticity. He flinched, a visible startle at the sound of my voice. "No." "Yes." "Doesn't matter," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "I need to go. Big meeting." He avoided my gaze, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head. "How did it get there? Was it a warning? Did she put it there?" He wanted to ask but couldn't. He couldn't afford to expose his guilt, not to me, the quiet, unsuspecting wife. He was trapped. The image of the selfie was now burned into his mind, and he had no one to blame but his own carelessness. His panic was delicious but fleeting. He needed a stronger, more lasting source of anxiety. It was time for the next layer of the plan. I had spent days analyzing the financial documents I found related to the joint development project with Samantha. David wasn't just using his influence. He was heavily leveraged. He had personally guaranteed a substantial portion of the financing, putting a frightening amount of our equity, tied up in the house, on the line. The twist wasn't just the affair. It was the catastrophic financial exposure he had created, and the ultimate irony. I, the woman he dismissed as financially naive, was the one who spotted the lethal clause in the contract, a clause that allowed a minority partner, which I knew David's unsuspecting, longtime partner, Marcus, was to initiate an immediate audit and halt development if certain fiduciary thresholds were breached, or if the reputational risk was deemed too high. I had already reached out to Marcus, David's partner, under the guise of inquiring about my own personal investment in David's company, a small, symbolic sum I'd insisted on contributing years ago. Marcus, an honorable man, was naturally concerned about any partner's spousal involvement. Our conversation was brief, polite, but informative. I didn't mention Samantha. I simply expressed deep, personal concerns about David's recent volatility and unwise risk tolerance regarding the new project. Marcus's reaction was immediate and grave. He confirmed the financial vulnerability. I gave him enough vague, professional language terms like unforeseen leverage and non-standard guarantees to trigger his professional anxiety. The stage was set. David's financial future, built on lies and reckless ambition, was now dependent on Marcus's patience and trust. Trust that I had just subtly undermined, simply by being a concerned wife. David came home late that night, visibly agitated. He kept looking at me, searching for a sign, a glimmer of accusation. I gave him nothing. I was calmly reading, a serene expression on my face. He finally spoke, his voice tense. "Clara, I think my car needs a wash. You haven't been in it, have you?" The question was clumsy, a desperate attempt to probe my knowledge without admitting his secret. I met his gaze, my eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Your car?" "No, David. Why would I? Is something wrong with it?" The lie was effortless, smooth as silk. He swallowed, unable to press further. He had placed the USB there himself, he had misplaced it, he must have been paranoid. His paranoia was now folding back onto itself. He had found the evidence of his betrayal, and in his desperation to hide it, he was now doubting his own grasp on reality. But the paranoia was about to get real, because Marcus was about to call, and when that happened, David would realize his little joke was about to cost him everything. Marcus called David the next day. I know because I was in the next room, working, when David's sharp, panicked voice cut through the silence. He was pacing, whispering urgently into the phone, using all the defensive and evasive corporate jargon he'd mastered. Marcus, I gathered, was asking sharp, specific questions about the financial guarantees and the reputational risks associated with the new development. My vague, professional warning had hit its mark. David's arrogance was immediately replaced by a desperate need to control the narrative. He was scrambling, assuring Marcus that everything was standard procedure and that my concerns were misplaced, simply spousal anxiety. But the damage was done. Marcus had a legitimate professional reason to be concerned, and in the world of high finance, concern equals risk. And risk means delay. I began phase 2. Subtle, targeted exposure of Samantha's involvement. Not to Marcus, not yet. But within David's immediate circle, I used my design connections, my freelance network, to casually drop hints about Samantha's sudden, unprecedented access to the lucrative development project. I posed as a competitor, a concerned professional wondering how this relatively unknown designer secured such a significant high-profile contract. The rumor mill in the Texas real estate and design world moves fast. The questions I planted were simple. Is the contract legitimate? Was the bidding process fair? Is there a conflict of interest at the partnership level? I didn't need to answer them. I only needed to ensure that David and Samantha's professional relationship was no longer viewed as legitimate talent meeting opportunity but as nepotism tainted by illicit leverage. David started snapping at me, his stress manifesting as aggression. He was under immense pressure from Marcus, from his investors, and now, likely, from Samantha, whose professional reputation was suddenly under quiet scrutiny. "You've been talking to people, haven't you, Clara?" he accused one evening, his eyes narrowed. "You're meddling in my business." I played my role perfectly. I looked confused, hurt. "David, what are you talking about? I barely leave the house. I spoke to Marcus, yes, about my small investment. I'm worried. You haven't been yourself." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. Is everything okay with your project? You seem stressed." I turned his paranoia back on him, subtly implying that his stress was the cause of the rumors, not my actions. He retreated, unable to prove anything but utterly convinced that his world was shrinking. The professional relationship between David and Samantha began to fracture under the strain. I knew this because David was often taking calls in his study, yelling, his voice strained and angry. Samantha was panicking. Her career, which David had promised to launch, was now tied to his sinking ship, and the whispers of impropriety were threatening her professional viability. She was no longer a mistress. She was a professional liability. I made my next move, the coldest one yet. I accessed the final version of the development proposal. David had saved the one with Samantha listed as the lead designer. I made 1-minute, surgical edit. I subtly highlighted the clause related to conflict of interest leading to reputational harm in the fine print, and then anonymously sent it to a mid-level manager at David's company who I knew was vying for David's position. I didn't include the selfie. The manager didn't need the picture. They just needed the leverage. I was not attacking David. I was simply giving his enemies the tools they needed to attack him. The collision point arrived swiftly, catalyzed by the desperate manager who saw an opportunity. David's company, under internal pressure and external scrutiny, initiated an unexpected, emergency review of the development project, citing unforeseen legal complexity. Samantha was immediately removed as the lead designer, a professional humiliation that effectively stalled her burgeoning career. David's arrogance had caused him to expose her, and my quiet action had ensured her removal. David was furious, volatile. He came home that evening, throwing his suit jacket across the room, demanding to know what I had done. "Someone is sabotaging me, Clara. It's all gone to hell. Samantha is out, the project is delayed indefinitely." He was looking for a villain, a single person to blame, still incapable of seeing that he was the author of his own catastrophe. I maintained my calm, my serenity a stark contrast to his chaos. "Sabotaging you, David? Why would anyone do that? You're such a successful, well-respected man." The sarcasm was subtle, woven deep into the fabric of my feigned concern. I turned the conversation. "Perhaps, David, your other commitments are distracting you. Perhaps your judgment is compromised." The word commitments hung in the air, loaded with implication. He stared at me, his eyes wide, a flicker of genuine terror crossing his face. Had I figured it out? Did I know about Samantha? He didn't know. The silence was his enemy. He couldn't confirm his fear by asking. He simply had to endure the uncertainty. The major twist arrived not through an explosive reveal, but through a document I had found months prior, tucked away in an old safe box David thought I'd forgotten about. It wasn't about the affair, it was about our house. David had been heavily leveraged for years, long before the affair, using the house as collateral for risky, previous ventures. I had quietly, through my lawyer, discovered that the deed for our home was almost entirely in my name due to a complicated, forgotten tax incentive he had utilized years ago and never bothered to correct. He had dismissed it then, saying, "What's mine is yours, darling." The ironic truth: David had built his entire financial risk exposure on collateral he did not legally own. I owned the anchor. And now, as his entire development project was freezing up, and the creditors began to circle, the only true asset they could pursue, the house, was protected by the signature of the wife he had mocked. I sat him down, not in anger, but with the quiet authority of a CEO delivering bad news. "David," I said, my voice low and steady, "I have filed the preliminary paperwork to separate my assets from yours. The lawyer advised me, given the unforeseen financial risks associated with your new project, it was a necessary step to protect my own security." I placed the deed for the house, the deed with my name prominently featured, on the table between us. He looked at the paper, then at me, his mouth agape. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly gray. He reached for the document, his hand shaking. "What is this? This is impossible. We fixed this years ago." I just shook my head slowly. "No, David. You were too busy building your new future to notice the small print of your old one. The one with me. You thought I was naive. You thought I was asleep. But I was just waiting." His eyes darted from the paper to my face, searching for the familiar look of distress or panic. But he found only cold, quiet resolve. His entire scheme, the affair, the professional leveraging, The massive personal guarantees all had been built on a foundation he no longer owned. His silence was deafening. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the profound, chilling realization that the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant was, in fact, the only thing keeping him from total financial ruin. But I wasn't done protecting myself. I needed him to understand the full weight of his actions, and the joke that started it all was about to get its punchline. David didn't argue. He didn't rage. He simply sat there, staring at the deed, the reality of his situation sinking in like a stone in deep water. The man who had been so loud, so boastful was now utterly silent. That silence, I realized, was the sound of a carefully constructed world collapsing. I let him sit in it for a moment, letting the weight of the document speak for itself. Then I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, intimate level, the tone of a secret shared. "I know about Samantha, David," I said, not as an accusation but as a simple, undeniable fact. "I know about the hotel. I know about the contracts. I know you built your lie using our life as scaffolding." He didn't deny it. He just looked up, his eyes hollow. "How long?" he whispered. His concern wasn't about the betrayal. It was about the exposure. "Long enough," I replied, the truth unnecessary. "Long enough to prepare. Long enough to ensure that when you finally got what you deserved, I wouldn't be collateral damage." I then delivered the final, calculated blow, the full stop on the sentence of our marriage. I referenced the beginning, the moment that had transformed me from a heartbroken wife into his silent executioner. "A few months ago, David," I began, my voice clear and steady, "you were on the phone, joking with a friend, laughing. You said, 'I regret marrying her every day.' You thought I didn't hear you. You thought it was funny." I paused, letting the memory hang between us, sharp and toxic. I watched the realization dawn on him, the sudden, sickening connection between his cruelty and my current action. He opened his mouth to stammer an apology, an excuse, but I cut him off, my voice rising slightly, carrying the weight of all my stored-up pain and power. "I heard you. And I want you to know," I finished, leaning closer, my eyes locked on his, "that I regret marrying you, too." His smile faded entirely. It didn't just disappear, it was erased. The look on his face was not one of anger, or even sadness, but of abject total defeat. He realized the joke wasn't just a betrayal. It was the final, arrogant catalyst that armed his opponent. I had delivered the punchline to his life. I stood up, the silence ringing in the room. "The house is mine," I stated, retrieving the deed. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. My lawyer has documentation showing you've been using shared assets for financial arrangements outside of our marriage. You will not contest the settlement, which will be finalized based on protecting my equity in the house. Your creditors will be looking for liquid assets, and without the house, you have very few left. You can stay in the guest room for now, but you are not to speak to me, or to Samantha, or to Marcus about this. We will handle this professionally. Because," I concluded, looking at the broken man in front of me, "I am doing this not out of anger, but out of calculation. And you, David, miscalculated everything." The power was no longer in his hands, it was mine. The aftermath of that single, devastating confrontation was swift. The dominoes, carefully tipped over by my patient hand, began to fall with brutal speed. David's financial situation, already precarious due to his reckless guarantees, worsened immediately. His partners, fearing the reputational risk I had subtly seeded, voted to suspend him from the project and initiate a forensic audit. His arrogance in commingling his personal life and corporate finance was now a liability too great for them to bear. I watched him from a distance, maintaining my cold, professional demeanor. He spent his days on the phone, desperately trying to salvage his deals, his voice thin and desperate. The man who had once exuded powerful charisma was now just a frightened child, exposed and vulnerable. Samantha, too, felt the full force of the fallout. Not only was she professionally embarrassed, but David's sudden financial crisis meant he could no longer support her or his promises. I saw her name pop up on David's phone logs less and less. When I finally overheard a brief, tense exchange, it was her voice, sharp and angry, demanding money, demanding answers. The mistress was learning the true cost of dating a liar, especially when his career became his entire identity. My action securing the house and initiating the financial separation had effectively cauterized the wound of the marriage, protecting my future while leaving David's life exposed to the natural consequences of his own choices. He had lost his career prestige, his financial security, and the woman he was trying to build a new life with, all within a matter of days. I spent the next few weeks working with my legal team, ensuring the divorce was as clean, quick, and financially devastating for David as possible. Within the bounds of Texas law, it was surprisingly easy. David was too demoralized, too distracted by his collapsing career, to put up a fight. He simply signed the papers, his signature a shaky ghost of the man I used to know. I never raised my voice. I never cried. I never engaged in a single emotional argument. I treated the entire dissolution of our marriage as a professional contract dispute. And in the end I won the dispute, not by being louder, but by being smarter, more prepared, and more truthful than he was. The quiet revenge was far more satisfying than any shouting match could have been. One afternoon, I came home to find a note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't from David. It was from Marcus, David's former partner. It was a brief, cryptic message, saying he was sorry for everything, and that he admired my strength. Attached was a small, sealed envelope. Inside, I found documentation copies of emails and memos that detailed David's past financial manipulations and corporate misconduct, going back 5 years. These weren't related to Samantha. These were his deep, long-held professional secrets that Marcus had uncovered during the audit, and had quietly decided to entrust to me. Marcus, an honorable man, was choosing justice over loyalty. David's lies ran far deeper than I ever knew. And now, I held the key to his absolute professional obliteration. The documents Marcus sent were devastating. They painted a picture of a man who routinely bent ethical rules, engaged in borderline illegal practices, and used his charm to cover a trail of professional misconduct. My revenge, up until this point, had been about self-preservation and justice. This new information transformed it into a moral obligation. David had moved out, staying with a friend, humbled and utterly broken. I hadn't seen him in 2 weeks. But there was one last piece of business. I needed to see the full, final collapse of his spirit. I called him, inviting him to the house one last time, to collect his remaining personal items. I used a neutral, businesslike tone. He agreed instantly, likely hoping for one last plea for leniency. He arrived looking like a ghost. His expensive suits were rumpled, his hair unkempt, the vitality and swagger that had defined him completely gone. He was thin, his eyes ringed with exhaustion and fear. He was no longer the imposing man I had married. He was merely David. A consequence of his own deceit. He tried to talk, to apologize, to rationalize. "Clara, I made mistakes. I know that. But you have to understand, the pressure." I held up a hand, silencing him. "I understand everything, David. You don't need to explain your mistakes. I've already calculated their cost." I walked him to the study, the scene of so many of his clandestine phone calls and lies. On the desk, I had laid out a single piece of paper, a summary of the evidence Marcus had provided, detailing the most egregious professional misconduct. "I protected myself, David. I saved my home, my peace and my sanity," I said, my voice steady. "The affair was the trigger, but your house of cards was always destined to fall because you built it on deceit. That, I left to fate. But this," I gestured to the paper, "this is a choice. Marcus gave this to me. He believes you need to face the full consequences of your choices, not just the marital ones." He read the paper, his face slackening further with each line. He realized the full scope of his vulnerability. Not just the divorce, not just the project delay, but the threat of legal action and career annihilation. His eyes lifted to mine, filled with a raw, desperate fear I had never seen before. "Clara, please. You can't. You'll ruin me. I'll lose everything," he pleaded, his voice cracking, the powerful facade finally gone. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a cold, clear pity. "You ruined yourself, David. The day you decided to mock me, to dismiss me, you signed your own fate. I am simply delivering the inevitable." I picked up the paper, tore it into small pieces, and dropped it into the wastebasket. "I won't use it," I said. "Not because I forgive you, but because I want you to live every single day knowing that your entire future rests on the goodwill of the woman you betrayed. Now collect your things, David. Your time in my life is over." David gathered his boxes, his movements slow and defeated. He left the house not with a bang but with a quiet, shuffling exit, closing the door softly behind him. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with finality. It was over. The marriage was dead, the debt of betrayal paid, the house secured. I stood in the center of the quiet living room, the Texas sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I should have felt triumphant. I did feel a quiet, profound victory. But beneath it was the emptiness, the residue of a shared life that had ended in such bitterness. I realized then that my revenge was complete. Not because he was ruined but because I was free. I had reclaimed my agency, transforming myself from a passive victim into an active participant in my own fate. I was no longer defined by his betrayal, but by my response to it. The cold, calculated Clara had done her job. Now, the woman who loved the sprawling Texas sky could finally breathe again. And then, the final twist, the one that truly cemented the cinematic irony of my fate. It arrived not through a legal document or a whispered secret, but through a call from a client I had pitched months ago, before the chaos began. The client was a major Houston-based developer. They had been highly impressed with the preliminary designs I had sent them. They were looking for an in-house design consultant to lead a new, ambitious, multi-phase project. The job was significant, offering creative autonomy, stability, and a salary that surpassed anything David had ever made. It was a lifeline, a future, independent and glorious. And the final, ultimate piece of irony? The project was a direct head-to-head competitor to David's failed development with Samantha. My quiet work, my dedication to my own craft, which David had always dismissed as a cute little hobby, was now going to be the financial engine of my new life, eclipsing his broken career. Destiny, it seemed, had a final, elegant twist in store, rewarding my quiet strength with a professional victory of epic proportions. I accepted the job without hesitation. The feeling was not one of vengeance but of profound, self-assured power. I had done the difficult work of dismantling the past, and now, the universe was handing me the blueprints for a dazzling future. I looked around my house, and saw it not as a relic of a failed marriage, but as the launching pad for my next chapter. David had sought to break me down with a joke. He had only succeeded in forging me into something unbreakable. The silence in the room was now heavy with possibility. I was ready to rebuild. And I was going to start by changing everything about the life he thought he owned. The divorce was final. The paper, signed and stamped, lay on my desk, a monument to a closed chapter. I felt an incredible lightness, a weight lifted that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The cold, calculating persona I had inhabited for months began to soften, to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. I started decorating the house, transforming it from ours into mine. I painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and filled the space with light and colors that reflected my own taste, not his muted, conservative preferences. Each brushstroke was an act of reclamation, each new piece of art a declaration of independence. The anchor he thought was keeping him grounded was now supporting my flight. My new job was demanding, fulfilling, and creatively challenging. I poured my energy into it, finding a deep, abiding satisfaction in building something tangible, something that would last. My colleagues respected me. My work was valued. There was no deceit, no manipulation, just honest effort leading to deserved success. The professional world was a clean, refreshing space compared to the toxicity of my marriage. I occasionally heard whispers about David. His attempts to start over were repeatedly stalled by the reputational damage I had ensured was firmly attached to his name. The financial audit had exposed enough to keep him out of any major deals. He was struggling, moving between odd jobs, the golden boy image tarnished beyond repair. Samantha, too, had disappeared from the local professional scene, her association with David having cost her dearly. There was a profound lesson in this quiet vengeance. It wasn't about the act of tearing him down, but about the act of building myself up. The planning, the research, the cold, strategic thinking, those were the tools that saved me. They were the muscles I never knew I had, forged in the fire of betrayal. I realized I was smarter, stronger, and far more capable than the woman who stood beneath the oak trees years ago, believing in a fairy tale. I learned that true power is silent. It doesn't rely on screaming matches or public displays. It relies on observation, preparation, and impeccable timing. David's downfall wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable consequence of his own character flaws. I simply provided the stage, the spotlight, and the impeccable sense of timing. I started dating again, cautiously at first. It was strange, navigating the world as a single, empowered woman. I looked for connection, for kindness, for honesty, not charisma, not ambition, not the empty promises of a man trying to fill a void. I learned to trust my own judgment, that deep, intuitive sense of warning that David had spent years trying to silence. One evening, driving through the city, I saw David. He was standing outside a modest suburban office building, waiting for a bus. He was alone, his shoulders slumped. He looked up, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes met. There was no recognition of the past in his gaze, no attempt at defiance, just a vast, profound emptiness. He quickly looked away, boarding the bus and disappearing into the crowd. I didn't stop. I didn't feel triumph or pity. I simply felt nothing. He was no longer a person who mattered to me. He was a memory, a closed case file. The quiet victory I sought was not the sound of his ruin, but the sound of my own peace. And I had found it. I had the sun-drenched house, the thriving career, and most importantly, the clear knowledge of my own worth. My marriage to David was a lesson, brutal and necessary. It taught me that love should not be an anchor that keeps you down but wings that help you soar. It taught me that when someone shows you who they are, you must believe them, and when they seek to diminish you, you must quietly, powerfully, reclaim your light. I learned that the most powerful revenge is not destruction, but creation. I didn't just tear down his life. I built a spectacular new one for myself on the foundation of my own strength. I transformed betrayal into leverage, and heartbreak into purpose. I often think about that day, the day he made the joke, "I regret marrying her every day." It was the cruelest thing he could have said. But in the end, it was the greatest gift. It snapped me out of my complacency. It gave me the cold, clear focus I needed to survive and to thrive. So, if you are watching this, and you feel that familiar sting of being unseen, dismissed, or underestimated, remember my story. Don't fight their chaos with your own chaos. Fight it with silence. Fight it with strategy. Fight it with the truth. They want your tears. They want your struggle. Give them nothing. Become the quiet architect of your own victory. He made a joke. I delivered the punchline. And that moment, when his smile faded and the full weight of his colossal miscalculation settled on him, was not an act of hate. It was an act of justice. It was an act of profound, empowered self-love. I survived. I won. And I did it all on my own terms. Thank you for listening to my story. If this narrative resonated with the quiet strength you've had to summon in your own life, I urge you, do not let your experience be forgotten. Subscribe now, and join the community of people who found their strength in the quiet. And if you've watched this far, and you won't subscribe, I want you to go down to the comments right now and tell me why. Tell me what fear, what hesitation, what final ounce of resistance is stopping you from claiming your story. We're here to listen.